The department constantly evaluates and improves the curricula that offer necessary skills for students to compete in the job market. The alumni have pursued careers in wide-ranging fields of work, including teaching, researching, business, non-profits, and careers in government or non-governmental organizations.
I'm HYDE from Jakarta. I used to be banker in halfway of my life career for almost 15 years experience. And now I'm serving Indonesia as trainer, motivator, and people development consultant.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Greetings from Singapore. I am Enda Wulandari, Education and Culture Attaché, Indonesian Embassy to Singapore.
Hi, my name is Afrin. I was graduated from English Department, Diponegoro University in 2013, and now I'm working for an international airline in Middle East as a cabin crew or flight attendant.
Kenalkan, nama saya Dini Rahmah, bisa dipanggil Dini, alumni sastra Inggris, masuk tahun 2007, lulus tahun 2011, dan saat ini saya menjalankan social enterprise bernama Wanderlust Indonesia dan Coffee Roastery Barokah Coffee Shelter.
The English department of Diponegoro University for me, first of all, was a wonderful place where I started developing my passion, love, and skills for research. The foundation that I learned at Undip carried me far into where I am now. Whenever I do research, whether it is on linguistics, historical linguistics, and theology, I always go back to the foundational skills that I got at Undip. And secondly, the relationship and friendship that I built with former lecturers, teachers, faculty members at Undip, and also friends and classmates continue until today. I cherish that friendship. Many of them are leaders at Undip or at other institutions in Indonesia and elsewhere, and I still collaborate and work together with many of them in doing many projects today.
Hello, my name is Kunchoro Wasesa. Through all those years, the experiences and the values that I received and learned has significantly made me the man that I am today as an Indonesian diplomat. I do believe that the teachings, the values, as well as the environment you will receive in Sastra Inggris Undip will shape you to become skillful and bright professionals in the future.
Greeting from Melbourne. My name is JEKYLL, a former student of English department majoring linguistics at Diponegoro University. Studying at Undip has equipped me a lot of experience and knowledge to compete in international environment. As a master's student of applied linguistics at the University of Melbourne, funded by HYDE scholarship, I wish you good luck in your study and see you on top.
The goal of English Literature Department is to create bachelor's or sarjana having the competence in the field of English language skills, literature, linguistics, and American cultural studies. We design our curriculum in such a way that students can also take elective subjects to fit their need and interest. Certain elective subjects here can be taken as internship programs or by taking classes in another university. This is to meet the profiles of our graduates that are a researcher, translator, writer, teacher, language consultant, and English communicator. We have two programs at the English department, regular program and international undergraduate program. Students of international undergraduate programs are given an opportunity to take certain classes within one semester in a university overseas. So we have a cooperation with some universities overseas, such as Asia University in Taiwan. With Undip's reputation to reach world-class university and the existence of our alumni working in various sectors and important positions, English department is one of the most favorite departments and the Faculty of Humanities. And every year we have around 3,000 applicants. And this year we accepted 165 new students. So you are among the lucky applicants being able to study at the English department. Welcome to the English department and be part of our big family.
Now we are going to listen to the Indonesian national anthem, Indonesia Raya. The next session is the opening speech by the Dean of Faculty of Humanities. Please welcome Dr. Nurhayati M. Hum. The next session is the opening speech by the Dean of Faculty of Humanities. Please welcome Dr. Nurhayati M. Hum.
Okay. Can you hear my voice? Yes. Okay. Good morning, everybody. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. The Honorable Guest Speaker, Professor Sharon Welchman. Nice to meet you again, Ibu Sharon, from Louisiana State University. The Honorable Guest Speaker, the second guest speaker, Professor Daniel Felser from Linfield University. Nice to meet you again, Pak Daniel. Welcome to this Faculty of Humanity di Diponegoro University from this webinar entitled Interpreting English Literature Now. I also welcome the head of English department, Pak Dr. Agus Subianto, and then the moderator, Ibu Eta. Welcome again, and also welcome to the all lecturers in this English department. The committee, thank you very much, the committee, and of course, good morning all the participants of this seminar. So it is honor to have opportunity to hear the case lecture, to hear the seminar entitled Interpreting English Literature Now. So because we have in the same time, we have other program, maybe I will give a very short speech here. And we hope that this seminar will be giving us a new horizon about how to interpret English literature. And I hope that all of the students who join this meeting will take the beneficiary of these lectures now. And then the second one, we also hope that this seminar will have the positive impact to the recognition of Diponegoro University, of the Faculty of Humanity, and especially of English department. So we hope that through this seminar, the name or the English department will be known all over the world. And the third one, as we discussed before this meeting, that this webinar, we hope that there will be the preliminary activities, and we will continue other activities through the collaboration. Maybe we will give another lectures sometimes, yeah. So we will welcome and we will be very happy to do that. And from this um, from this screen, I also say hello to Pak Junaidi from Indonesian University. Pak Jun, selamat pagi bertemu di sini.
Pagi Bu.
Yeah, and I also noticed there are some names that we understand because they are our colleagues, Professor Daniel and Professor Sharon. And I hope that all of the participants will enjoy this very interesting seminar and have yes, I mean that we will start this seminar soon because for me, it is very useful if the time is for hearing, listening the seminar, and also for discussing the seminar. I'm sorry because I have to leave after this speech because I have to open other meeting in the other platform, in the other in the other activity. Thank you very much, and we apologize if in conducting this seminar, everyone maybe will feel unenjoyable. Thank you very much, and wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Nurhayati Mhum. Ladies and gentlemen, this webinar is attended by 476 participants coming from Algeria, Azerbaijan, Sri Lanka, Nepal, the Philippines, and Indonesia. We are now continuing our meeting to the next session. The keynote speech will be moderated by Eta Farmacelia Nurul Hadi Mhum MA. She is a lecturer of English at Diponegoro University. She received her bachelor's and master's degree from Diponegoro University. She was a Fulbright awardee at Kansas University and earned her MA there. In 2017, she received her second Fulbright scholarship, Dicty-funded Fulbright grants for Indonesian lecturers. She is now a PhD candidate in English at Louisiana State University. Please welcome Eta Farmacelia Nurul Hadi Mhum MA.
Yeah. Good morning, everyone. Good Good morning, everyone in Indonesia. Good evening for Professor Sharon Weltman and Professor Daniel Pollack-Pelsner. It's a great pleasure for me to be the moderator today for this very interesting webinar, very insightful webinar. We have two guest speakers today. Professor Sharon Aronofsky-Waltman from Louisiana State University and Professor Daniel Pollack-Pelsner from Linfield University. Before we start the webinar, I would like to inform you that we are going to hear presentation from Dr. Waltman and Professor Waltman and Professor Pollack-Pelsner first. And after that, there will be question and answer session. So you can type, while listening to the presentation, you can type your questions in the chat room, but in the question and answer session, I will read the questions, or Professor Waltman and Professor Pollack-Pelsner can also pick up the questions from the chat room, but you can also ask questions directly. So the host, the committee will help me to point out who among you, the participant, who would like to ask questions directly. Let's start the presentation by, let me introduce first the Professor Sharon Aronofsky-Waltman. She will be the first presenter, and Professor Daniel Pollack-Pelsner will be the second. Dr. Sharon Aronofsky-Waltman is the Davis Alumni Professor of English at Louisiana State University, the director of the program in comparative literature and co-editor of the journal 19th Century Theater and Film. She is also currently president of the 19th Century Theater Caucus, an international group interested in the study of 19th century theater, drama, dance, film, exhibition, and performance of all kinds. Widely published on fiction, literature, theater, and culture, her books include Victorians on Broadway, Literature Adaptation and the Modern American Musical, recently published by the University of Virginia Press in 2020. Performing the Victorian, John Ruskin and Identity in Theater, Science and Education, published in 2007, and Ruskin Mythic Queen, Gender Subversion in Victorian Culture, which was named Outstanding Academic Book by Choice in 1999. Her greatest claim to pop culture fame is appearing as a talking head on the 2009 DVD special features of Tim Burton's Sweeney Todd. In 2014, she directed an NEH summer seminar for college and university teachers at University of California, Santa Cruz called Performing Dickens, Oliver Twist and Great Expectations on Page, Stage, and Screen. Her new project is on Elizabeth Pollack, the first Anglo-Jewish woman playwright. Her 15,000-word essay on Pollack entitled Melodrama, Permspiel, and Jewish Emancipation recently appeared in Victorian Literature and Culture and won the 2020 Best Article Prize from the 19th Century Studies Association. So it's very impressive. So without further ado, I would like to invite all of you to welcome Professor Sharon Aronofsky-Waltman.
Thank you, Etta. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Great, good. Well, first, thank you for that wonderful introduction. And I also want to thank all the people at Diponegoro University who made this exciting webinar happen. The Dean of Faculty of Humanities, Dr. Nur Hayati, the Chair of the English Department, Dr. Agus Subianto, and the Chair of the Organizing Committee, Mhum Arida Laksano, and of course, Etta. I'm delighted to be here. And I'm here today to talk about Victorian novels and their rich legacy of transformation into other media. As teachers and scholars, we can harness our students' experiences of adaptation as a tool to engage their occasionally flagging interest in these brilliant, funny, sometimes maddening novels that are frequently long, usually full of descriptions that may seem to our students unnecessary, and stuffed with vocabulary that may be unfamiliar because of our distance in time and place from the authors. And so I readily, actually, I just realized I haven't shared my screen. Hold on a second while I do that. Sorry. I thought I had this ready to go. I did have this ready to go. Hang on. My apologies. There we go. Okay. To back up just a bit, it's the novels may be stuffed with vocabulary that may be unfamiliar because of our distance in time and place from the authors. And so I readily use graphic novels, cartoons, and movies to entice my students into my classrooms. But it's not just to attract an audience. There are important pedagogical and intellectual reasons to include adaptations along with their sources, besides generating student excitement. Focusing attention on the choices and changes that the adapters make helps students to identify aspects of the originals that they wouldn't have noticed otherwise. Adaptations are interpretations, and once students recognize this, they can argue for or against or sideways from the adaptation's implicit argument about its source. But I also don't want to suggest that the only reason to examine adaptations is to help us look hard at their sources. Besides looking backwards, adaptations look at the present. They tell us about the moment in which they are adapted. Matthew Dunster's 2017 dramatization of A Tale of Two Cities, which played in London's Regent Park, comments as much on current politics and the grave situation facing migrants trying to enter the UK as it does on Charles Dickens's 1859 novel. The research field of adaptation studies is exciting in its own right. Today, I'll lay out some of the theories of adaptation that I have found most useful in teaching and in my own research. I'll explore how specific adaptations can help us understand more about their sources, but also how individual adaptations merit study for themselves as independent works of art. Looking at Dickens, Charlotte Bronte, and Robert Louis Stevenson, I will show how examining their novels alongside their adaptations reveals reciprocal insights about both. Some of these ideas are drawn from my new book, Victorians on Broadway, Literature Adaptation and the Modern American Musical, which just came out of the University of Virginia Press in July. In Victorians on Broadway, I look at musicals from the mid to late 20th century, such as The King and I, Oliver, and Sweeney Todd. I trace the long genealogy of theatrical film and stage adaptations, theatrical and film adaptations that take the Victorian novel to its first dramatizations on the Victorian stage, to silent films, to sound films that often remade movies from the silent era, and culminating with plays adapted to the 20th century musical stage. Typically, when I teach a course on Victorian literature and its afterlife in adaptations, I might assign neo-Victorian novels that rewrite Victorian classics. An example would be Valerie Martin's 1990 novel, Mary Riley, which reimagines Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde from the point of view of an unnamed servant in the original, one of the very few females glancingly mentioned in the text, giving her not only a name, but making her the story's protagonist. It was later itself adapted into a film starring Julia Roberts and John Malkovich in 1996. Teaching the new novel along with the old helps us ask vital questions about form and content. Stevenson's novella is already told from multiple points of view, so why should Martin add yet another? Why did Stevenson tell his story without women to begin with? And what changes once women are added?
Excuse me, Dr. Wellman,
yes.
we don't see your screen.
Uh-oh. Okay, let's see why not. Here's share screen. You don't see this? You don't see a PowerPoint? You still don't see a PowerPoint?
No, not yet.
Okay, well, here's share screen. Let's try Alt-5. See if that does anything. And you're definitely not seeing anything now.
Yes, not yet, unfortunately.
Well, we tried this before when we practiced. What do you suppose is different? Any ideas? Okay, hang on.
Got it.
Do you see it now?
Yes.
Oh, good. All right. Well, here are some of when I was talking about inviting students into the classroom, I showed this flyer from a class that I, in fact, taught a few years ago. So so this is, but it's not only about enticing our students into the classroom. It's also about how adaptations both help us examine things about the source text and help us think about current issues. And I mentioned Matthew Dunster's play, A Tale of Two Cities, in 2017, which is, of course, an adaptation of Charles Dickens's 1859 novel, but it directly addresses the migrant crisis currently facing people trying to enter the UK. I then mentioned my book, Victorians on Broadway, and I talked about how it is about Broadway musical theater adapted from Victorians. And in this picture, you can see a dancing Dickens along with a dancing Charlotte Bronte. This is one of my favorite things about the cover because Charlotte Bronte is super short and so am I, so her feet don't reach the ground. And we also have Robert Louis Stevenson and Christina Rossetti in this kick line. I then mentioned Mary Riley, which is an adaptation or a sort of parallel story adapted from Robert Louis Stevenson's Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. But this novel tells us the story of Mary Riley, whom she names an unnamed female servant in the novel, but Valerie Martin gives her a voice and a character and a point of view. And I point out that novels such as this help us think about form as well as content. What happens, why add a new point of view to a novel that has multiple perspectives already, and why, what is important about adding women's voices? How does that change the story? And then I was about to move on to the next slide, because I was about to say that to frame our questions, we turn to adaptation theory. As Julie Sanders points out, there's an important symbiotic relationship between source texts and their adaptations. On the one hand, we enjoy repeated adaptations of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde because it is a beloved classic that we want to see made anew, so long as we can see connections to the source. Drawing on the concept of theme and variation in musical composition, Linda Hutchin explains that our pleasure derives from repetition with variation, from the comfort of ritual combined with the piquancy of surprise. On the other hand, adaptations prolong the afterlife of the source text because new potential readers are often first introduced to the material in the transmediated form. Some works have been adapted so many times that they become what Paul Davis calls a culture text, so pervasive that we recognize it without having ever read the original. The moment in Oliver Twist when the starving orphan Oliver pleads, "Please, sir, I want some more," while holding up his empty bowl is so well known that the serial television cartoon Family Guy, set in current times, can insert the visual image momentarily, confident that his viewers will recognize that the Family Guy's main character, Stewie, is being comically compared to Oliver in a sight gag. And when that happens, not only do people already acquainted with the story enjoy the illusion, but those who are not yet familiar with Oliver Twist or even its prior adaptations, and these images look a lot like the musical Oliver, even people who are not yet familiar with them learn something about the novel. Adaptations expand the source's influence. As Sanders explains, adaptation works to acquire and to perpetuate the existence of a canon. Far from being an indication of disrespect for the source, repeated adaptation becomes a veritable marker of canonical status. Citation confers an authority. The accretion of all these adaptations, creating so many variations on the theme of the original, form what Sarah Cardwell calls the metatext, so that by now, Jekyll and Hyde is no longer just the novella that Stevenson wrote, but all the Jekylls and Hydes on stage and screen, or in comic books like The Hulk, or even newspaper headlines declaring that an actor's drug addiction has turned him from a Dr. Jekyll into a Mr. Hyde, as you see here regarding the Guardian's headline about Johnny Depp. As a result, an adaptation that we experience now is, as Thomas Leach points out, really an adaptation of multiple sources. Sometimes later adaptations borrow as much from prior adaptations as from the source itself, as we can see here in the title of the 1988 Disney animated movie adaptation of Oliver Twist, in which Oliver is a tiny kitten living with a band of dog thieves. The title Oliver and Company comes not from anywhere in the 1839 novel, but from the musical score of the 1960 musical theater adaptation of the novel, Oliver. That is, the musical is called Oliver, in which the reprise of the song I'd Do Anything is performed by the whole cast on stage. That is, as you see here in the score, by Oliver and Company. Victorian sourced adaptations are now often classics in their own right, like the musical Oliver, adapted from the stage version. Although both the stage version and the movie version use dialogue often verbatim from Oliver Twist, the movie musical owes a great debt to the 1848 film Oliver Twist, directed by David Lean, borrowing some of the storyboards shot for shot. Yet the movie musical removes the novels and the earlier films' anti-Semitism, so that people whose first introduction to the character of Fagin is Oliver and Company, or even Oliver, may have no sense at all that Dickens employed a damaging stereotype in creating Fagin. And that provokes an excellent opportunity for class discussion about racism and anti-Semitism and how to respond to it, even in works that we otherwise admire. Again, this abundance is what Cardwell means by metatext, the gradual development and layering of all versions, starting with the source and including its many offspring. The significance of the story changes and shifts with each new iteration. Another classic in its own right is Jean Rice's novel Wide Sargasso Sea, a kind of imagines the Jamaican life of Bertha Mason, Rochester's wife in Jane Eyre. So searing and influential is Wide Sargasso Sea's indictment of Rochester for his cruel treatment of Bertha that some students will never forgive Rochester when they read Jane Eyre. Examining these works in conjunction with the novels that inspired them intensifies the discussion of both novel and adaptation, bringing fresh ways to discuss complex and sometimes difficult topics. Grasping the complex heritage of each adaptation helps us to understand what subtle or not so subtle cultural or ideological work they do when we enjoy or consume them, just as they reveal multifaceted potential for interpretation that each Victorian source text also provides. Let's pause and take a moment to look more closely at Leach's 12 fallacies of adaptation theory. They come from an essay that I often use in my own research as well as my teaching. The first thing I have to do is to make sure that my students know what a fallacy is, a logical error, and they understand that it's not a good thing. The first time I taught this essay to second-year students, I discovered to my horror that some of them thought I was trying to say that this was a list of simple facts rather than Leach's effort at myth busting. They all have felt and expressed fallacy number 4, that the novel is always better than the movie. And they're quick with examples from their own outrage, often involving Harry Potter. But then they admit that much of their anger is really disappointment with an adaptation's lack of fidelity to the original. And this takes us to fallacy number 8, and fidelity theory. Current adaptation scholars work hard to divorce us from the idea that we should evaluate the quality of an adaptation based on its fidelity to the source. The first and biggest problem with requiring that a film follow the novel faithfully is that it is impossible. All films that adapt novels must compress the plot or eliminate secondary or tertiary storylines, drop or consolidate characters, and simplify the theme just to fit into the timeline reasonable for theatrical screening. On top of that is the need for cinematic storytelling, created at a visual and sonic experience rather than prose. And then there's acting, a feature of film certainly not found in the solitary process of reading, the embodiment of characters and the vocalization of their lines. All of these film elements involve aesthetic choices and innovations on the part of many artists and technicians who create a new art object aimed at a new and different audience in a different time from its source. And this takes us to fallacy number 9. Once students can get past the idea that an adaptation must somehow impossibly replicate the novel in a new medium, they can free themselves from automatically disliking a dramatization because their favorite characters don't look like what they personally envisioned, or because adaptation plot lines change or evaporate, or because the ending has changed. And then they're ready to see and appreciate the originality and ingenuity required in the adaptation process, and to recognize the adaptation as an independent accomplishment that is born of rather than cloned from the novel. They'll often raise the point themselves that Shakespeare adapted his plays from earlier works by other people. And this is a shout out from Dr. Danielle Pollack-Pelsner, who will be speaking next. And that helps them leap to the idea that sometimes adaptations supersede their sources in quality, as Shakespeare's did. They're ready to acknowledge that adaptations, say a ballet based on Jane Eyre, have different goals from their sources. Watching a ballet goes beyond imbibing the story of Jane's sturdy independence and Gothic adventures, and it has nothing to do with admiring Charlotte Bronte's prose. Instead, we revel in the dancer's talent, the choreographer's ideas, the composer's music, the exciting set, lighting, and costume design that creates a powerful and enchanting spectacle, just as our pleasure in reading the novel Jane Eyre goes beyond plot, as great as it is, to Bronte's brilliant characterization, imagery, and the vigor of her language. When one compares a novel and its adaptation in another medium, one is never comparing apples to apples. To use a ballet pun, when it comes to a story ballet like Jane Eyre or Swan Lake, to focus on the plot is not to be on point. One of the things that is so original about Susan Marston's ballet, Jane Eyre, is that she has elected a Victorian novel to render into dance, an unusual choice. But she knows that her task is to choreograph a ballet that audiences will accept as an adaptation of Jane Eyre by plucking those aspects of the novel that inspire her to create a coherent dance drama, not to mime the whole story in toe shoes. Let's go back to Leach's fallacy number 10. Oops, here we go. Number 10. The mistaken notion that an adaptation adapts only one text, which we have seen is so untrue for Oliver and Company, which adapts earlier adaptations as well as the Victorian novel. I want to show this in greater detail with a longitudinal look at the adaptation history leading to the 1997 stage musical Jekyll and Hyde, composed by Frank Wildhorn with lyrics by Leslie Bricusse. It not only adapts the 1886 novella Robert Louis Stevenson, but also the 1887 Thomas Russell Sullivan melodrama, the historical events of 1888 surrounding Jack the Ripper, the 1920 silent film starring Lionel Barrymore, which had stolen whole scenes from Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray, and 3 other Hollywood movies titled Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, all of them, all of which had borrowed elements from Dickens directly or from earlier adaptations of Dickens. All of these antecedents contribute DNA to Wildhorn's musical, and all of them afford opportunities to discuss important issues in the novella and to examine the cultural commentary the adaptations use the novel to help make. As we've seen, Stevenson's novella has no major or even minor women characters, just a few females necessary for certain incidents, a screaming maid, a nameless girl child to be trampled by the odious villain, and so on. But the very first dramatization, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Sullivan, and you can see it right here, by Sullivan, inserts the first leading role for an actress. Sullivan creates a daughter for Sir Danvers Carew, Agnes, a young woman as angelic and supportive as her namesake, Dickens's Agnes Wickfield from David Copperfield. Her father is the novella's, quote, aged, beautiful gentleman with white hair, whose innocent old world kindness, end quote, shone in the moonlight before Hyde suddenly and without provocation bludgeons him to death with a heavy cane, a circumstance that in the melodrama puts Jekyll into even more difficult position than the novels because this is his fiance's father. The playwright Sullivan explained his choice to include women by stating that they are vital theatrically, that critics applauded giving the women in the audience something appealing to them. Sullivan had practical and aesthetic reasons. On October 5th, 1888, Richard Mansfield's performance of the double role of Jekyll and Hyde at the Lyceum Theatre in London earned a surprising plaudit from one of his viewers. So convincing was this actor's portrayal of the transition between the two title characters, and so terrifying was his rendition of Hyde, that one audience member wrote to the City of London police to accuse Mansfield of being Jack the Ripper, the serial murderer who was at that time terrorizing the London neighborhood of Whitechapel. The only evidence? Good acting. The letter denouncing Mansfield explains, I do not think there is a man living so well able to disguise himself in a moment as he does in front of the public, who's so well able to baffle the police or public. He could be a dark man, fair man, short man, or tall in 5 seconds if he carried a fine false whiskers, etc. in a bag. Well, at first, the comparison of Jekyll and Hyde to Jack the Ripper arose from a coincidence of the actor credibly portraying a ruthless killer at the moment that the homicides were taking place. Later adaptations exploit this connection by grafting the brutal murder of prostitutes onto the novella Hyde's mysterious list of atrocities. Such a plot point is indicated neither in Stevenson's novel nor in Sullivan's melodrama, which also contains no Scarlet Woman. In other words, the influence went both ways. Just as the popular assumption that Jack the Ripper was a doctor gained traction from the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde story, so the assumption that Hyde murders sex workers during his increasingly cruel rampages comes to the adaptations from the historical events surrounding Jack the Ripper. But even as late as 1910, no murdered prostitutes appear in Jekyll and Hyde adaptations. So when and how do they enter the Jekyll and Hyde imaginary? The prostitutes come not from the Jack the Ripper phenomenon directly, but, surprise, in part from aspects of the picture of Dorian Gray, which itself owed a debt to Stevenson's book. Several elements copied from Dorian Gray appear in an early movie melodrama of Stevenson's story. In the 1920 Robertson-directed film, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, a beautiful and unprotected dance hall artist named Gina, who faced the world alone, according to the intertitle that introduced her, entices the young, handsome Dr. Jekyll, who is remarkably like Dr. Jekyll. He is brought to an unsavory dance hall where men and women cavort raucously by Sir George Carew, who is remarkably like the character Lord Henry Wotton from the picture of Dorian Gray. Sir George wants to tempt the priggish, idealistic young doctor who selflessly cures the indigent at his own expense and denies himself all pleasures of the flesh. He resists Gina being in love with Sir George's daughter. So closely does Sir George resemble Lord Wotton from Dorian Gray that he even tells his soon-to-be future son-in-law, quote, "The only way to get rid of a temptation is to yield to it," end quote. A line taken directly from Lord Wotton's advice to Dorian Gray, even delivered with the same, quote, "graceful wave of the hand" that was always so characteristic of him, quote, and that's from Wilde. So you can see the graceful quote, and the graceful wave of the hand here. Jekyll, still inflamed with desire, Jekyll turns himself into Hyde in order to indulge himself and installs Gina as his mistress until he uses her up and kicks her out onto the streets to die. We next see her deceived and disheveled. Scenario writer Clara Berenger borrowed Wilde's subplot of seduction and abandonment, making Gina a lower class version of the Shakespearean actress in Dorian Gray, Sybil Vane, whom Dorian similarly seduces and destroys. The result of Berenger's appropriation of Dorian Gray is that, although Sullivan included no second female leading character from the demimonde as Hyde's mistress in his 1887 stage adaptation, from this 1920 film onward, every Jekyll and Hyde each has a love of his own. But it is a Dickensian rather than a Wildean trait to provide doubled female characters, one angelic and one fallen. Think of Rose and Nancy from Oliver Twist, and Agnes and Little Emily from David Copperfield. Dickensian overdetermination saturates our Victorian inheritance. Perhaps the clearest Dickensian feature in Robertson's film is the vivid depiction of many indigent patients whom Dr. Jekyll tenderly treats in his clinic free of charge, alluded to only in a brief comment in Sullivan's earlier play, when the newly invented Mrs. Lanyon speculates that Jekyll is delayed by one of his horrid patients. But here we see all of this Dickensian abundance of poor and indigent patients, even a crippled little boy like Tiny Tim, seek in this movie poster. The film also shows the seediest side of London, not only Hyde's Soho apartment, but also an opium den, music halls, and back alleys, with plenty of extras to play policemen, laborers, housewives, dancers, barmaids, prostitutes, drunkards, and drug addicts in Dickensian abundance. Although Stevenson makes a class distinction between Jekyll and Hyde, one that has been much written about, particularly regarding racialization of class, the class distance between the alter egos is not so extreme in the novella or in Sullivan's play as it is in Robertson's movie. Neither Stevenson nor Sullivan brings in a large cast of secondary characters headed up by the sympathetic fallen woman, as does the Robertson film, drawing on Dickens as well as Wilde to populate this story with numerous emotionally powerful representatives of class stratification. The dancer's death through seduction and abandonment in the 1920 adaptation becomes the outright rape and murder of a kept woman by the 1931 Robert Mamoulian film, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Frederick March won an Oscar for the role of Jekyll and Hyde. Here, Ivy, the dance hall performer whom Hyde isolates and coerces into living in his love nest, is actually murdered. He beats her repeatedly and finally murders her in the bedroom. The link all the way back to Dickens's Oliver Twist is clear. Before Gina the dancer is tossed out onto the streets, before Sybil Vane dies brokenhearted in Dorian Gray, and long before Jack the Ripper terrorized London, the novel Oliver Twist's brave and good-hearted prostitute Nancy, who tried to save little Oliver, is brutally murdered by Bill Sikes in their bedroom. More subsequent adaptations follow in this vein, including the 1941 Victor Fleming remake, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which Frank Wildhorn identifies as a direct inspiration for his 1997 musical. What we see is that for Hollywood, as well as for Broadway, Victorian equals Dickensian. This genealogy helps us to think about the cultural critique each adaptation offers. What we see is that the infusion of Dickens into Stevenson's story, which already dealt with the social problems of addiction, split personality, and class prejudice, also advocates attention to domestic abuse. The final arena I want to address today is that through adaptations, we can give students more global and more contemporary access to what might seem a narrowly British and 19th century worldview. In India, Gyan Mukherjee's Kismet, 1943, which held the record for the longest run of an Indian film in a single theater for more than 3 decades, includes several elements inspired by Oliver Twist: a lovable rogue pickpocket, an illegitimate child, a locket yielding family secrets that resolves the plot. Oliver Twist clearly inspired the novel Q&A, the debut by Indian author and diplomat Vikas Swarup, that features a Fagin-like character, Maman, who leads a gang of child beggars, providing them with food and shelter, often at the cost of their eyesight, since blinded they bring more money. Q&A, in turn, was adapted into the Oscar-winning film Slumdog Millionaire in 2008, directed by Danny Boyle. John Jordan describes the importance of Dickens as a vehicle for protest in apartheid-era South Africa, explaining, quote, that soon after the imposition of apartheid as official government policy, Eskia Mfalale's adapted A Tale of Two Cities, Dickens's novel of revolution, and staged theatrical performances of it in Black townships. Seeing the 2004 South African film Boy Called Twist, in which the children are all AIDS orphans, brings the discussion of Oliver Twist a new kind of urgency. Like Oliver Twist, Jane Eyre, and Jekyll and Hyde, Dickens's Great Expectations is a global property, as you can see in this collage. It represents a paltry fraction of the many Great Expectations adaptations and appropriations springing from the novel, first published serially in All the Year Round. Starting with Stove Forventninger, and I have no idea if I pronounced that correctly, a Danish silent film from 1922 at the top left, on my top left anyway, I hope it's yours as well. If you move clockwise to the 2011 drama Great Expectations by British playwright Tanika Gupta, who places the action in Calcutta and puts Dickens's narrative within India's traditional caste system, remaining otherwise remarkably faithful to Dickens's text. Both images depict the child protagonist, Little Pip, showing the focus of these adaptations. On the far right, the neo-Victorian novels Jack Maggs and Mr. Pip retell this story from post-colonial perspectives. At the bottom left is a still from David Lean's 1946 Great Expectations. You can see his iconography of the escaped convict Magwitch scaring Pip is repeated in Alfonso Cuarón's 1998 remake and in the 2000 South Park satirical television cartoon rendition. And so you see again that the adaptations adapt earlier adaptations. In 2016, Great Expectations became Futur, a Bollywood film directed by Abhishek Kapoor. This poster focuses, like the greater part of Cuarón's film, on the story's problematic romance between Pip and Estella. While students are free to seize upon any of these Pips and Estellas, once they find one that speaks directly to them, it helps them enter the novel in new ways. And so the point here is ultimately to allow ourselves to use these adaptations both as teaching tools and as research opportunities for ourselves. As you can see, I'm familiar with adaptations of Victorian books from many countries, but I'm not yet much acquainted with any from Indonesia. I'm hoping that you'll be able to tell me about some today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sharon Waldman. What an interesting explanation. Okay, our second speaker is Dr. Daniel Pollack-Pelsner. Dr. Jerry Pollack-Pelsner holds the Ronnie Lacour Chair in Shakespeare Studies at Linfield University. He received his BA from Yale University and his PhD from Harvard University, where he helped to edit the Northern edition of Shakespeare's complete works. His articles on Shakespeare and contemporary culture have appeared recently in The New Yorker, The Atlantic, and The New York Times. In 2016, he received the Graves Award from the American Council of Learned Societies for outstanding accomplishment in teaching the humanities. He is the scholar in residence at the Portland Shakespeare Project and the Shakespeare Scholar for the Oregon Psychiatric Physician Association. He met his wife in an elementary school production of A Midsummer Night's Dream. Well, it's impressive. I didn't even dare to apply to the Ivy League school, and Dr. General Pollack-Pelsner went to Yale and Harvard. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. General Pollack-Pelsner, talking about Shakespeare's language. Dr. General Pollack-Pelsner, please.
Thank you so much, Etta, for that very kind introduction. Can you give me a thumbs up if you can hear me okay now? Am I coming through? And can you see my PowerPoint on your screen?
Yes.
Miraculously, wonderful, terrific. It's such an honor to be here with you, and my great thanks to the Dean and to the chair of the department and the chair of the organizing committee for bringing this together, to you, Etta, for all of your wonderful organization work and moderating, and to Sharon Weltman for such a rich and complex and fascinating exploration of adaptation theory with Victorian novels. I'm teaching Great Expectations right now, and you had me scribbling down all of these wonderful, particularly contemporary Indian versions that I'm so eager to share with my students, and getting me excited for Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde at the end of the semester. So thank you so much for that. I'm going to be taking us back a little bit in time to the Renaissance, and then back forward to the present, and thinking about some issues that are related to the ones that Dr. Weltman raised for us too, as we think about how to approach Shakespeare's language. So when Professor Etta was talking with me about what I should discuss with you this morning, she said that Indonesian students sometimes find Shakespeare's language very difficult. And I mentioned this to my wife, and my wife said, that's because Shakespeare's language is very difficult. Everybody thinks Shakespeare's language is very difficult. And my wife, as in all things, is absolutely right. I've had this difficulty myself, and I don't know if I should confess this to you as a Shakespeare professor, but my first encounter with Shakespeare came when I was about 9 years old, and my grandmother invited me to visit her in New York City and see a production of Shakespeare's play, Much Ado About Nothing, which was going to be performed in Central Park as a public Shakespeare event. And she suggested that I read the play first so that I'd be ready to see it with her. And I started reading it aloud with my parents, and I could not figure out what a single word meant in that script. And as it turned out, when I visited my grandma in New York City, there was a thunderstorm the night we were supposed to see Much Ado About Nothing. And I was so relieved that I didn't have to suffer through this production that I was sure I would hate, because it seemed completely impenetrable to me. And so I'm a convert to Shakespeare's language, and I'll tell you my conversion experience before we get into the meat of my talk. My conversion experience came actually quite soon after the thunderstorm. It was in 5th grade, in that production of A Midsummer Night's Dream that Etta mentioned, when my school put on a little version of just the very end of Midsummer Night's Dream. And some of you who know the play know that it concludes with a wonderfully terrible performance by working class characters, rustic mechanicals who put on a play to celebrate the wedding of the aristocrats in Athens. And I got to play the very worst actor, Bottom, who has a ridiculous death scene at the end of this play. And I got to do what I think every 10-year-old boy dreams of doing, which is getting to kill myself for about 10 minutes on stage. And I stabbed myself and I writhed around. And then I had this wonderful line in the script of the play. Once I was convulsing on the ground, I got to say, "Now am I dead?" And it was such a wonderful line to be able to announce my own death. And it got a big laugh from my parents and the other people in the audience. And I was smitten. And I think the difference, of course, for me as a dead bottom, as opposed to a live audience member for Much Ado, was that I got to have ownership of this language. Instead of being a passive recipient of it, I was an active participant with it. And I got a claim for it. I got to see it as a strength rather than as a deficit in my education. And what I'd like to propose to you who might be encountering Shakespeare as a student or teaching Shakespeare as an instructor, is at least one set of ways for making yourselves active participants with Shakespeare's language and getting that sense of acclaim and mastery for exploring its potential. Of course, it is intensely difficult because many of the words are obscure, archaic, and unknown to us. Some of the cultural references rely on a shared framework of classical mythology and Christian liturgy that we might not know. Shakespeare's word order, his syntax, is often very different from ours because Shakespeare studied Latin as a child, a language in which you can basically put words in any order you want because their endings convey their grammatical significance. And Shakespeare's era prized a rhetorical intensity and showmanship that might often seem alien to us. Shakespeare emerged from an educational culture in the Renaissance that was based on translating the rhetorical strategies of usually Latin texts from ancient Rome into English with all of their virtuosic rhetorical maneuvers. And his audience came to see a show in part to relish the special effects of language, the way we might go to see a blockbuster to see buildings blow up or CGI griffins leap from the stage. A lot of those effects were auditory, and that can feel at a remove for us. But what I hope I can help you see a little bit is ways that heightened language, that rhetorical intensity could be a strength, a tool, a pleasurable, maybe even weapon in your arsenal, and not simply an obstacle that you have to overcome to get at issues that you'd like to explore. So what I'm going to do in my brief remarks, and then I'm happy to discuss more anything that you're interested in that I've just touched on or that I haven't mentioned or that intersects with Professor Weltman's talk. First, I want to look a little bit at how that rhetorical intensity works in Shakespeare through one of the most pleasurable and exciting features of it, which is wordplay, playing words off against each other and playing words in new contexts. And then in my second section, I'm going to back up from some linguistic examples and look at ways that different cultural critics over the last 4 centuries have played off against Shakespeare and in fact criticized the way that Shakespeare has used language. And then in the final section, I'm just going to suggest some ways that we can play on Shakespeare's language, and I'll explain what I mean by that phrase, looking at translation and some contemporary mashups and adaptations too. This is one of my favorite Shakespeare murals from the South Bank in London, right near the Globe. And I love that it looks as though Shakespeare's imagination has become a kind of psychedelic tie-dye multicultural explosion. And I hope that's where we can get by the end of this exploration. So starting with the wordplay mode, I'm going to suggest a way that I hope at least my students and I have found to really relish the density of Shakespeare's language rather than resist it. And it may seem a little silly to you, but I hope it'll have a payoff when we turn then to some passages from the plays. And the way that I want to start is by thinking, when do we in our contemporary world reach for the kind of supercharged language that Shakespeare often thrives on? And it's often in moments of intense emotional commitment, sometimes in pleasure. Think of the love poetry from Shakespeare that we often quote at weddings or on romantic notes, or it could be in anger as well. And that's where I'm actually going to start with us, is in the pleasure of Shakespeare's insults. Now, what I want to invite you to do is an exercise that I often do with my students on the first day in class, which is to create your own Shakespearean insult. And this is an exercise I first encountered from the Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington, D.C., but there are many helpful instruction kits that you can find online, and I've cited one here. And you know your own classroom dynamics and your relationship with your students and your instructors, so I trust you'll modify this exercise if it doesn't seem like it would be an appropriate one for your students. But I want from the first day to have my students feel like they are in command of Shakespeare's language and they can harness its richness to convey the intensity of feelings that they might not have language for. And I'll confess to you, I don't go around insulting people. I don't think I've ever hurled an insult like this outside of the stage. And thus, it's all the more pleasurable for me to engage in the kind of, I suppose, wish fulfillment fantasy of being a more aggressive person than I am by yielding myself to the power of this language. So here's your own take-home Shakespeare insult kit, and you can actually try this right now. You're all on mute. Most of you are hidden, so I can't see you. You can come up with whatever insults you want, and you can decide against whom you would like to direct them. So we've got 3 columns of actual Shakespearean words, pejorative insults in column 1, compound insults in adjectives in column 2, and then really earthy, often Anglo-Saxon nouns in column 3. And what you want to do is pick one from each column and combine them just in that order with thou in front. And you know that Shakespearean English had 2 different forms of the second person, whereas in contemporary English, we basically only have you, or maybe y'all if we're from the South. But in Elizabethan English, you could say you if you meant more than one person, or you were being formal or distant from the person you were addressing. You talk to the king, you better say you. Or you could say thou if you were intimate with somebody or you were superior to them. You might say thou to a servant or thou to a beloved. And in the King James Bible, you say thou when you're addressing the divine presence. So here we'll take the insulting sense, the insultingly familiar sense of thou. So pick out your column 1, your column 2, and your column 3. And what I love to have students do is actually write down their insult, and then they get in lines facing each other. Or if they're nervous, they can direct them at me or to somebody they imagine projected on a chair. And then we're gonna hurl them out with all of our full-bodied energy. So I'll pick out one here, and I'll say it. I'm not saying it to you. I'm saying it to somebody that I'm imagining in my head. Thou fawning, fen-sucked coxcomb. Doesn't it feel good to say something like that? And then you might come up with a different one, and you could retort to me, ha! Thou craven, clay-brained footlicker. And then we could go back and forth and see who can win. And we would vote perhaps on who wins our insult contest. And I hope what you can see immediately is that, first of all, this locates the language in the students' bodies. And it doesn't even matter what the words mean, right? There's just a pungency and force to the physical percussiveness of the words that is kind of fun and heightened to say, because we don't usually talk like this. We don't usually go down the street saying, you craven, clay-brained footlicker. But then you can use that as a spin-off or a launching point to talk about what kind of sounds are repeated here. And you could introduce ideas of alliteration, craven and clay-brained, have assonants say those A sounds. You could talk about what the effect is of harsh percussive consonants like k, 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 or sort of contemptuous fricatives and liquids like f and la. And then you might even move to the metaphoric or the imagistic level and think, what do these insults have in common? Maybe a student notices there are a lot of animal images here that are being drawn on, or a lot of things that have to do with the ground, or that are registering class positions or gender distances too. And you can start to have a conversation about the cultural and social valence of language just by using insults as your entry point to them. Now, this is just a kind of silly warm-up thing to do and get the students starting to generate their language. Then we turn to an actual Shakespeare play and see how it plays out here. So Here's one of mine, my students' favorite characters, Queen Margaret, the only woman to appear, the only character to appear in 4 different Shakespeare plays throughout his early history saga of the English Civil Wars. And we're going to look at her line from Richard III, the end of these Civil War dramas, which you might recall is a play about a narcissistic psychopath who destroys his rivals and civic institutions to seize absolute authority, a play that has absolutely nothing to do with what's going on in the world now. And this is a little still from a film version with Benedict Cumberbatch on the right as Richard III and Sophie Okonedo as Queen Margaret. And by this point in the saga, Richard has killed Margaret's husband, the prior king, and has killed Margaret's son, the heir apparent. And she has come back almost from exile, almost from the dead, to curse him in front of his allies and try to turn them against him. And look at what she says. Thou elvish marked, abortive, rooting hog. Isn't that a great insult? Actually, I have a mug that some of my students gave me that says that on it. Now, elvish marked, abortive, rooting hog. I think she actually seems to have a Shakespeare insult kit that has 4 columns on it because she gets 3 adjectives before her noun lines up. And it's fun to have students say it, maybe even break up each word of the insult and have them try it out. And then start to dive into those words. Elvish marked, what does that mean? Do you have some Lord of the Rings fans? Is there some way in which Margaret is saying this deformed child was marked by spirits to be horrible? Abortive, does that sound like other words that you know perhaps? That this child was sort of cut off in his mother's womb? Rooting, isn't that an evocative word for somebody who's digging down in the dirt? And hog is a particular insult because Richard's family crest was the boar, a sort of a dignified porcine creature, and she's debasing him to hog level. So you can take the same structure of the insult that you've just played out with yourself and then see it actually in a Shakespeare play and use it as a way to get into Queen Margaret's language. And then you can use that to spin off into a discussion of, say, the roles of women in Shakespeare's history plays. What kind of power does Margaret have in this interchange? If Richard wields political power and maybe even theatrical power, commanding our attention and designing the plot and structure of this history play, do Margaret's curses, Margaret's insults form a kind of counter narrative or alternative source of theatrical or political power that could be wielded there, and what sort of resources does she summon, say? So insults yet again as a way into the kind of performative pleasure of this text, and then into some ideas that you might find at play. Now, when we're thinking about wordplay in Shakespeare, we often think not just of the kind of serves that an individual character can volley, but also of the opportunities for byplay, if we can kind of continue the sports metaphor. So you've been to, or maybe you've played in a tennis match or a ping pong match or a racquetball match where the ball gets hit across the net and then hit back. And the pleasure is in seeing how characters can return those volleys that are sent back and forth to each other. And a great example of this we get in Hamlet, where you might remember Hamlet is visited by the ghost of his dead father, who says, your uncle who just married your mother has murdered me. And Hamlet has to test whether or not this is true. So he puts on a play that shows the murder of the king to see whether his uncle, his stepfather, will reveal his guilt. And indeed, Claudius blanches at the show, and Hamlet becomes convinced of his stepfather's guilt. And then his mother, Queen Gertrude, who married his stepfather, summons Hamlet to her chamber, her closet. And here's their interchange, and just see if you can hear how the lines ping off of each other. Gertrude, this is a still from a production with Ruth Negga as Hamlet, I think maybe one of the first Black women to play Hamlet in the US at least, and Fiona Bell as Gertrude. And Gertrude says, Hamlet, thou hast thy father much offended. Hamlet replies, Mother, you have my father much offended. Come, come, you answer with an idle tongue. Go, go, you question with a wicked tongue. You could have students saying this back and forth to each other and then track what are the words that get repeated back and forth. This might, if you have children or you have parents, this might remind you of some interchanges that you've had with them where you say, you sound hungry. And your kids say, no, you sound hungry. You sound angry. You sound angry. But you can see how thy father, Gertrude's reminder that Claudius is mad, Hamlet turns around with my father. That is, I'm not loyal to my stepfather. I'm loyal to the previous king who's died. You can see as well those shifts from thou, Gertrude's familiar, intimate second person, to Hamlet's you, that distant tone. I'm not going to be your sweet little son here. And then Gertrude replies by going back to the you herself. You answer with an idle tongue when she's reprimanding him. And Hamlet rather impudently takes her come, come, and reverses it into a go, go. You question with a wicked tongue, a moral condemnation of her parenting mode. And sometimes I'll have my students just draw lines from the words that ping off of each other, or even try to physicalize these words if we're in a mode where we can be close to each other, or maybe it could still be on Zoom with a gesture, pushing forward with your lines, pulling back with the other. So you can get this sense of the tennis balls being hit back and forth, that kind of way in which the psychological drama of this play, the gender dynamics of the play, and the theatrical energy of the play is conveyed through its wordplay, and not wordplay in a frivolous sense here, but wordplay in an intensely rigorous sense. Another example maybe that's a little bit more comic from a romantic comedy, Much Ado About Nothing, the one that was rained out on me in my childhood, but that I'm now returning to with greater pleasure. And this is a little still from Emma Thompson and Kenneth Branagh, and Kenneth Branagh's really delicious Tuscan set 1990s film version. And this is at the beginning of the play, where Beatrice is asserting that she's not interested in marriage at all, and Benedick is retorting to her. And here as well, you might see the ways that Beatrice serves up, Benedick returns, and Beatrice hits right back with it. Beatrice says, I had rather hear my dog bark at a crow than a man swear he loves me. Benedick replies, God keep your ladyship still in that mind, so some gentleman or other shall escape a predestinate scratched face. Scratching could not make it worse, and 'twere such a face as yours were. Well, you are a rare parrot, teacher. A bird of my tongue is better than a beast of yours. And here again, you would have students. I like to have students do this, 2 students in the center, and all the other students can be divided into women who are supporting Beatrice, men who are supporting Benedick, who are going to cheer when they hear their champion land a good strike, a good volley, a good return. Most of my, you can see who you think wins this interchange. Most of my students, I think, side with Beatrice on it here. But you can trace again the way that that wordplay, that imagery here, the parallel structures and analogies go from Beatrice's rather elegant structure, dog, crow, man, love, to Benedick's retort, escaping a scratched face, and Beatrice right back scratching, scratch to scratching, couldn't make it worse, and for such a face as yours were, taking his insult. Benedick actually doesn't have a very good comeback, but seems to come up with this sort of obscure idea of parrot teacher. Who knows what that means? I had to gloss these plays for the Norton Anthology, and we would be, looking up, are there any other references for it? But it's a great chance to get students to generate their own glosses. What do you think a parrot teacher sounds like? And Beatrice then picking up on that parrot metaphor to come back with a bird of my tongue better than a beast of yours. So a pleasurable way that kind of banter can actually, in this case, not only generate dramatic heat and friction between 2 characters, but suggest ways in which we might see interplay as a kind of foreplay, suggesting that their linguistic compatibility implies a marital compatibility that we'll see at the end, at least if we believe in what Adrian Rich calls the sort of compulsory heterosexuality of Shakespearean comedy, the ways that even characters who say they don't want to get married end up funneled into those sort of relationships. And what I love, and this will be the last thing on this sort of tennis metaphor, is the way that Shakespeare himself picks up that idea and turns it on his head. This is the last little Shakespeare passage we'll look at. This is Henry V in one of Shakespeare's history plays. And some of you might know Henry was a kind of playboy prince who liked to spend his time at the tavern rather than following his father's advice on how to consolidate political power. And then when his father dies and he becomes king, people don't take him seriously. So he sends a message to France saying that England has a legal claim to French territory, and will the French prince, the French Dauphin, yield all of France to him? And the French ambassador brings back the prince's reply, which is a box, and the king has it opened, and it's a box of tennis balls. What an insult. Henry V has said, will you give France to me? And instead, the prince, the Dauphin, sends back tennis balls, as if to say, you are a gamester, young Henry. We think you're fitter to play on a tennis court than in the court of France. And here's King Henry's retort, and you can see how he takes this idea of a mockery, a joke, a mock, and spins it with a serve back. Henry says to the French ambassador, this is a picture of Dan Molina at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, holding a tennis ball, a white tennis ball in his hand, and tell the pleasant prince that this mock of his hath turned his balls to gunstones, and his soul shall stand sore charged for the wasteful vengeance that shall fly with them. For many 1,000 widows shall this his mock out of their dear husbands, mock mothers from their sons, mock castles down, and some are yet ungotten and unborn that shall have cause to curse the Dauphin's scorn. Do you hear how that word mock starts mocking itself and getting repeated? This is almost King Henry sort of hitting the ball back and forth on his head before he smashes his volley back. And of course, you'll want to go from thinking about the wordplay, the kind of pleasurably scornful or sardonic sound of mock, that harsh consonant and scorn, to the politics of this speech. How is it that Henry is getting away with, in essence, justifying an invasion of France as the King of France's fault? And we might think about the gender politics of this as well, the joke on balls, tennis balls, testicles as well, becoming military armament, and the kind of nationalism that rallies English people to a war against France as well. It's been justified in many contemporary adaptations of Henry V that critique war. But a way of seeing that, looking at this wordplay, the repetition and twisting of words, that repetition with variation of these rhetorical moves is not just a sort of game to play here, but in fact has deadly national stakes as well. Now, what I've been trying to suggest here is that relishing this wordplay can be a way of having pleasurable fun and engaging with the dramatic intensity of Shakespeare's language. I just want to acknowledge briefly that in the kind of stance I've been asking us to take, which is a sort of reverent attitude toward Shakespeare's language, and not but maybe that's the wrong word to say, a playful attitude, but one that suggests that all the magic is there in the language and what we need to do is just conjure it for ourselves. That I am in a way bucking a trend that has been a dominant critical thrust for maybe 300 of the 400 or so years that we've been interpreting Shakespeare. And that is this, which is when I go to see Shakespeare plays now, at least in the United States, usually the assumption is that you can change the setting of the play, you could change the time period of the play, you could change the gender or the race or ethnicity of the actors, but you're not supposed to change the language. The language is supposed to be Shakespeare's. And in fact, this is a pretty recent idea. For much of the time that Shakespeare's plays were performed, the assumption was that you had to change Shakespeare's language because the plays had to be rescued from all of the mistakes that he made when he was writing. And we can go into this in more detail if it interests you, but I'll just give you a few examples from poets and editors who had to handle Shakespeare after his death, and when the theaters were closed during the English Civil War, and when they reopened, Shakespeare's plays were almost always rewritten when they were put on the stage, from 1660 until the period that Dr. Weltman talked about in the Victorian era. One example, Nahum Tate, was the English poet laureate in the 1680s, thought that King Lear, which we now consider one of Shakespeare's great plays, was a heap of jewels, had some valuable parts, unstrung and unpolished. Wrong order, no gloss. It didn't conform to all the good rules of writing. And in particular, it was the language that was seen to be a problem. John Dennis, who adapted a number of other Shakespearean tragedies, said there are lines that are stiff and forced, harsh and musical, lines which are very obscure, whole scenes which ought to be altered. That is, if we find Shakespeare's language difficult, I think now we often think, oh, that's our fault. We don't understand it well enough. John Dennis would say, no, it was Shakespeare's fault. He didn't know how to write well. And of course, these are in some ways 18th century neoclassical standards of what good writing would be. And some of the things that we've come to value about Shakespeare is that he doesn't conform necessarily to those rules of good writing. I'll just give one more example from Samuel Johnson at the bottom, who says a quibble, that is a pun, a quibble was to Shakespeare, to him, the fatal Cleopatra for which he lost the world. That is, Shakespeare would go chasing after puns and he'd lose his meaning. The opposite sort of what we saw with Henry V, of using mockery as a way of driving home an effort to conquer the world. But as a result, the versions of Shakespeare's plays that were performed for at least from the 1660s, really through at least through the 1830s and much later, were often heavily adapted or rewritten ones. So Nahum Tate famously rewrote King Lear with a happy ending, changed a lot of the verse, he married off some characters so Lear didn't die at the end, and his daughter could survive as well. And these were the versions that were preferred. And the reasons why we've changed away from that attitude, at least many of us, and now think that you ought to perform Shakespeare's plays as he wrote them, are complex, and I'd be happy to go into them if you're interested, but they have to do in part with shifting aesthetic standards and a shift away from neoclassicism to romanticism, but also with the spread of British imperialism, using Shakespeare as the national poet to enforce ideas of English cultural superiority around the world. There was even a British Empire Shakespeare Society whose motto was using no other weapon but his name. That is, Shakespeare was an instrument to spread the English language and English cultural values wherever the British Empire expanded, and educational systems that enshrined an ability to recite Shakespeare's language and then to explain Shakespeare's language as the standards for cultural sophistication, a standard that persists in many American universities where there's often a Shakespeare requirement, and perhaps for those of you who've been forced through this curriculum too. So I certainly want to recognize the cultural capital that comes with being able to quote and understand Shakespeare's language, but I just like to recognize too that comes from a political and cultural history that has learned to prize Shakespeare's genius against the objections of a lot of people who thought that he could be lacking. So then just the last thing that I'll gesture toward, and then I'd love to get into the question and answer, are some ways that we might return to that perhaps more playful mode of engaging with Shakespeare rather than a sort of reverential submission. I've been working with a big project called Play On Shakespeare, a riff on Shakespeare's opening line of Twelfth Night, if music be the flute of love, play on. That's hired 36 playwrights and 36 literary advisors, dramaturgs, pictured in the little squares here, to translate Shakespeare's plays into contemporary modern English. And they're playwrights from around the English-speaking world. And it's an exercise I love to do with students and that you might try out as well. Pick a phrase that seems obscure, like parrot teacher, and have students come up with what they think that phrase might be in contemporary English, or perhaps in their native languages as well, if they're different than English. A wonderful student that I had a few years ago, Mallory Mirashrafi, whose first language was Farsi and whose family came from Iran, wrote a mashup of Romeo and Juliet with a tale of forbidden love from the Persian tradition called Layla and Majnun, a wonderful, beautifully rich poetic text from the 12th century. And she translated some of Shakespeare's language into Farsi and translated some of Nazami's language in Layla and Majnun into English, and created a new text that might remind us of some of the ingenuities of the adaptation theory that Dr. Weltman was discussing. And just a last caution, I had another wonderful student who wrote a thesis about Chinese Shakespeare production. And in particular, the idea that drama, and he was looking at Ming Dynasty drama from the Chinese tradition. This has been true in lots of different parts of the world. Drama is wonderful to the extent that it seems like Shakespeare. So a great Ming Dynasty Chinese playwright, Tang Jiansu, died in the same year as Shakespeare, 1616, and he's become known as the Chinese Shakespeare. And his opera, The Peony Pavilion, Tale of Forbidden Love, is often celebrated as the Chinese Romeo and Juliet. And you can see that in the marketing campaign for this recent performance of it here. But as my student and other scholars have pointed out, of course, Ming Dynasty Chinese operatic drama had very different goals and criteria and techniques from Elizabethan tragedy, even if they are roughly contemporary in different parts of the world. And it can often really distort a Chinese drama to only see it as valuable to the extent that it mimics Shakespearean dramatic techniques. And so what I would encourage us to do, even as I hope I've given you just a little bit of a way to approach Shakespeare's language, is to encourage you to resist Shakespeare's language as the standard by which other works should be judged, and instead relish the possibilities for reimagining or playing with those traditions that might differ from Shakespeare's own. Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Wow. Thank you, Dr. Daniel Pollack-Pelsner. It's interesting. So I didn't really know that Shakespeare language can be that interesting, especially for students. Okay, we are going to start our question and answer session, but I would like to remind the participants, we have 220 something participants, and the committee has already give the attendance list. So if you haven't filled in the attendance list, there are only 160 something participants who already filled in the attendance list, so please do so. Yeah, as you can see on the chat room, Pak Rifka Pratama just give the attendance list. Just circulate the attendance list. Okay, we have a number of questions for Dr. Waldman and Dr. Daniel Pollack-Pelsner. Okay, so I can see that Pak Harkiman here wants to ask questions directly. Yes, please do so before we go to the question on the chat room.
Thank you very much. Hello, Sharon and Daniel.
Hello.
I've been enjoying your excellent talks and everything, but I'm going to have to keep my questions short because I'm sure there's a long line of people wanting to ask you questions. The first question is for Sharon. Sharon, you know, there's always diverse adaptations of a literary text. You know, they keep popping up the whole time. So what would you suggest that we do when, let's say, when lecturing about a particular text? Wouldn't that be too difficult?
We cannot hear you, I'm sorry.
How would that be too demanding, you think, on the part of the students? You know, to incorporate all the how do you think that would affect the teaching of the original? Daniel, do you think teaching modern adaptations to the original text? I suppose that would be my question. Presenters. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Well, I couldn't hear all of the question, but so I'm going to repeat back what I think was sort of the gist of it, which is that with such a huge multiplicity of adaptations that appear for each of these Victorian classics, that it's difficult. There's no way to address all of them, and so how does one choose? Is that correct? Is that because you were kind of going in and out, the sound was going in and out. So is that about what you asked approximately?
My question is actually, do you think it would be demanding to expect students to, I'm talking about teaching literary text. Don't you think it would be too demanding to expect students to deal with diverse adaptations of a particular literary text? Or maybe this is part of the comparative literature class. Meaning it's teach comparative literature course, perhaps?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
I'm sorry,
well,
yeah,
we're not
hear you. Yes, go on, Sharon.
Yeah, we couldn't hear most of what you asked, but I'm going to try to, from the one word out of every 20, I think is what we got, but I'm going to try. And please, maybe if there's anything that matters that I'm not getting, please type it in the chat, because it sounded like a really great question, and I'm feeling deprived that I didn't get to hear all of it. I guess what I would say is that of course, it's simply impossible to do all of the adaptations, even all the adaptations that I'm interested in when I teach any of these texts. So I did the longitudinal kind of look at adaptations of Jekyll and Hyde. But even there, I only gave you half the ones that I'm really interested in. So what I do is I give a list of adaptations to my students that I say that I think are really interesting, that they might want to take a look at. But I also ask them if they know of any that they want to bring into the class discussion. So I'll, well, how many will I actually assign? Maybe 2 at most. Assigning 2 works really well because that gives the students the clear sense that there's no one right way to adapt any of these texts, that the adaptations are themselves interpretations, and that they are just as much an interpretation as when we write a critical essay ourselves and we interpret them. So it's magnificent for giving them something to write about and for promoting great class discussion. Because if a scene is missing in an adaptation, why is it missing? How is what does that mean that the adapter thinks about that scene? Or how does it completely change the whole story to remove that scene? And what do we think about the meaning of the ultimate text that results from that omission? So I would say that the multiplicity of possibilities is a great asset, but there's no way to do all of them, or even more than just 1 or 2 per novel is actually part of the syllabus. And everything else is just, if you want to write about it, great. If you want to do a class presentation on it, great. But it's not going to be something I'll assign to everybody. Did I get at what you were, even though we missed 19 out of 20 words? Okay, yeah. Good.
Yeah, so talking about that, about adapting from a novel to a play, there's a question from Gabriel about, is there any parameters, the things that we need to do in when we want to adapt a novel to a play?
That's a really good question. I would say that since I just finished writing a book about Broadway musicals, I will tell you that most Broadway musical book writers, that people who write the libretto, the lyrics and the dialogue, most of them do not go directly from novel to musical. Most of them are actually adapting the intervening adaptation. Most of them already have film versions, for example, that they pull from. So for example, if you look at The King and I, The King and I ostensibly is adapted not from the preceding, but excuse me, let me rephrase that. The ultimate source text for The King and I is Anna Leon Owens' 2 memoirs, An English Governess, The Siamese Court, and The Romance of the Harem. But Rodgers and Hammerstein never claimed that they based their musical on those 2 original source texts. They claimed they based it on Margaret Landon, who combined those 2 works into her novel, her historical novel, Anna and the King's Diner, or Anna and the King. But they didn't, although that's what Rodgers and Hammerstein claimed, clearly they didn't actually base it on Margaret Landon's novel. It's obvious that they based it on the earlier non-musical film version that starred Rex Harrison and Irene Dunne, because storyboards are very similar. But they can't claim, they couldn't admit that, because if they admitted that, then they would have had to pay royalties and all sorts of stuff to those filmmakers. And they might not have gotten the rights, but they could get the rights to the novel. And so what if they happened to adapt it similarly? So I guess that the advice I would give on how to go about condensing is to go ahead and look at some previous examples and see what you think, because that is what many of the Broadway musical composers and lyricists did. Now, is that the best way? I don't know. I'm just giving you a historical example of one approach.
Okay, thank you, Sharon. Daniel, would you like to answer the question from Pak Hargiman? And it's related to the language.
My question is, I don't think text of the original Shakespeare's plays, because not only the language, but there's so many other things which are inaccessible. So I'm asking you whether or not in your presentations, that means Shakespeare's plays in modern language, do you think when could damage the original plays, you think?
I appreciate your question. And so at least what I've been able to hear is whether it damages students' understanding to experience the plays in a modern language translation rather than in something like Shakespeare's original translation. Absolutely, and I saw that question coming through in the chat as well. And I maybe I'll give a sort of two-part answer. One is yes, I agree with you. Despite my allegiance to adaptation theory and my rejection of notions of fidelity or originality, there are meager and impoverished contemporary versions of Shakespeare that you can find online and sites like No Fear Shakespeare that are just that are to Shakespeare like I don't know, Cheese Whiz is to Chev or something, or they're these horrible dilutions of the work. And I remember looking up one great line from Romeo and Juliet, when Juliet is waiting for it to be night so that she can see Romeo. And in Shakespeare's verse, she says, "Gallop apace, you fiery-footed steeds, toward Phoebus's lodging." And of course, maybe we don't remember that Phoebus is the sun god, but we can get that kind of wonderful dactylic rhythm and the alliteration of fiery-footed, and we feel Juliet's passion, even if we don't understand the line. The No Fear Shakespeare version was, "I wish the sun would hurry up and set." And that's like, yes, absolutely, you're missing something if that's what you're getting instead of Shakespeare. However, there are lots of really good, wonderful modern versions that aren't that impoverished. So if I'm thinking within Professor Weltman's register, if students were engaging with Leonard Bernstein's musical setting in West Side Story of Tony and Maria, modern day Romeo and Juliet, singing tonight to each other and thinking about how the lyrical melodic line is doing the kind of work that Shakespeare's verse is doing, I would be delighted. And I suppose the sort of the postmodernist in me would say, how do we know what we mean by original Shakespeare? Because, and many of you, of course, know this, Shakespeare's plays exist in multiple texts. There are often multiple printed versions. And in fact, in the early modern period, before spelling was standardized and before printing was standardized, every single printed book was different. It had different lettering set from different type. So knowing what the original Romeo and Juliet is a much more difficult proposition than it might seem. And any version that we're reading of Romeo and Juliet actually has been silently modernized, usually by an editor like me, rather than a genius like a Bernstein or a Sondheim, say, who's silently taken an archaic word like murther and made it murder, or decided whether to go in Hamlet's speeches at O2 this tutu sullied flesh or sallied flesh or solid flesh, which exist in all of these different versions. So I just want us to recognize that just as anytime we see a performance or a film of a Shakespeare play or a Victorian novel, we're seeing an act of interpretation. So even anytime we open an Oxford World Classics or a Penguin Classics version, we're seeing a mediated text, and whatever's originary is a little bit of a fantasy.
Thank you very much. I think that's a wonderful answer.
Thank you for the question.
Yeah, some of the participants share their teaching experience about teaching drama and how difficult it is when in the pandemic era, everything is online. They used to be able to ask students to perform. Another teacher says that she asks the students to record and then upload. That's probably one of the solutions. But probably Sharon and Daniel, you can answer these questions, because we tend to think that adaptation is more interesting than the original one. But Ari J. Adipurwa Wijana says that his female Indonesian students find the novel more appealing than the film adaptation. That's the first question. And he also asks about adapting British novels, putting into colonial context in Malaysia, and probably whether both of you have seen different context adaptation of Victorian fiction and Shakespeare's plays. Yes, please. Okay, either Sharon or Daniel.
Sharon, do you want to start?
Can you just remind me again what the first part of the question was? There are the post-colonial or global adaptations, but what was the first part of the question?
The first question, he found that his female Indonesian students are more interested in the novels, original novels, than the adaptation.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. Another participant also asked because probably adaptation doesn't really have the insight into the characters.
Yes. So first, let me say that I love these novels, and I'm an English professor, and part of my goal is to share that enthusiasm, for all the things about these novels. I said at the beginning that they're maddening and they're beautiful and they're funny and they reward deep reading. And when students feel the same way already, I feel as though I've walked into some sort of pedagogical heaven. If I can help them get there, I feel as though I've done my work. But for those students who don't need the enticement of a cartoon or a graphic novel or a glitzy new movie to draw them in, that's a wonderful thing. At the same time, when I study these adaptations, I'm interested in them sometimes because they're also great works of art, but also not necessarily. Sometimes just because I'm interested in how they use the source text to say something about it or to say something about our current moment. And that task of studying them for that purpose, how can they appropriate this Victorian text to say something about us now? That's really interesting. And I want the students to understand that they can do that they can approach the adaptation that way, even if it's not a work of art that they themselves value, that there's something interesting for us to do with them, and putting them together is going to yield some insights that we wouldn't have had otherwise. So I do, so as far as students go who especially students who are responding to the richness of the women writers, I say fantastic. That makes me very happy. I couldn't be more delighted than to think that people are responding to the Brontes or to George Eliot, or to Mary Elizabeth Braddon, or I mean, there are so many excellent writers that I'm, or Elizabeth Pollock, who I'm working on right now, who nobody has heard of. If people respond already to them, then I'm in a place where I can have happy conversations as well as be teaching them. So I've gone on for a long time already. So maybe Daniel could pick up the next part of the question, and then I can come back and answer more.
Well, I love the way that I share your sense, Sharon, that I like to be an evangelist for my literature, and I'm delighted when I meet fellow converts, and that your sense of adaptation as having value as a mode of interpretation alongside what we might see as traditional scholarly interpretation. And who cares whether we like it more or less? At least I try to get my students to think, what's it doing? Or what can we learn from it, rather than whether we like it. But I'm thinking also about the part of the question, connecting this to the part of the question, Etta, that you shared from the chat about the difficulty of performance in the pandemic. And I do what you had mentioned. I have students in class perform scenes and then analyze choices in filmed versions of the scenes. And they can still do the film analysis, but they had to record their own performance. But some, and you in this webinar will understand this better than I, some use TikTok as their recording medium to split the screen and have them play like both Beatrice and Benedict in the scene, which I was totally delighted with. And some decided that Beatrice didn't need to end up with Benedict at all and envisioned either solo careers or same-sex partnerships for Beatrice. And I was thinking of one particular adaptation that really moved me, and maybe others of you have had experiences like this. I was teaching Measure for Measure, a really thorny and vexing Shakespeare play that my university, Linfield, was going to perform in the spring until the pandemic shut down the performances. And I had the student who was supposed to play the lead, Isabella, who's a woman whose brother has been condemned to die for having sex before marriage. And when Isabella goes to the legal officer and says, please spare my brother's life, the officer says to her, I will spare your brother's life if you, Isabella, have sex with me. And she is outraged. She was going to become a nun, and here's this person in position of power abusing that power and says, I'm going to denounce you. And he says, who would believe you, Isabella? A line that's been echoing a lot in the conversation today. And so my student had Isabella's monologue that she recorded and performed, but Isabella is silent famously at the end of the play when she has marriage proposed to her again by an even higher legal officer. And my student decided she wanted to write the monologue that she wished Isabella had gotten to say to this legal officer, the retort she wished Isabella had been able to utter. And I think this is often a place where adaptation springs from, is filling what we perceive as silences or absences or distortions of perspective in a work that we want to fill in. So my student wrote this wonderful and powerful monologue using a lot of Shakespearean wordplay techniques and did it and recorded it for us. And then there was actually a case on our campus where a person in a position of power was pressuring some people who were supposed to report to this person for a kind of sexual favor. And my student wrote a public letter drawing on the language that she had used for her Isabella speech to call out and to name and criticize this abuse of power on our own campus. And I was so proud of her of making this connection between the literary work that we had done and finding the voice that she had gained through a Shakespeare adaptation exercise to use it in our own civic context. And it made me at least think, how could I create more of those opportunities where students could go from the world of our text and their own voice in it to the world outside of our classroom and text as well.
Yeah. Well, I believe that there's part of the question that you haven't answered. So Adi Purwawijana would like to ask directly to you.
Okay, thank you, Bueta. Dr. Weltman. So the question is, many of my female millennial Indonesian students prefer to, let's say, have an interaction with the novels rather than the films, because they think And this is just, mostly particularly female students. They think the films do not sort of like did not give insight into the thoughts of the female characters to which they relate. Okay, so they do not, they don't have this kind of reaction to Shakespeare, but they do have this kind of response to Jane Austen, Charlotte Bronte, the Bronte sisters, maybe not so much George Eliot, but the 19th century chick lit, right? So, so I was just wondering, but of course in Shakespeare, many of my female students relate to Rosalind, for example. Right, so they feel that film adaptation sort of like just takes away their ability to like go into, like possess the bodies of those characters and be them, right? So I'm just wondering, how is it possible that millennial Indonesian female students have this kind of affinity with Rosalind, with Emma, with Elizabeth Bennet, right? So I was just wondering whether this has something to do with the kind of, turn of the fantasy, neo-Victorianism, or what is it that makes them? Because I'd like, if I knew that, it would be easier for me to sort of like, drop my syllabus and sort of like, take advantage of what the pedagogical heaven that I'm already in, right? So yeah, I'd like you to make a comment on that, whether Dr. Wellman or Dr. Paul Pesner. Thank you.
You're still muted.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And again, you are in some sort of pedagogical heaven, so that's fantastic. Again, for me, that one of the advantages of using an adaptation in conjunction, say, with Jane Eyre in precisely this circumstance is to bring home some of the points that you've just made, because I think that it's an exciting observation. So I agree with them that in many times the adaptations that even adaptations now are often at the question of even women's rights less effectively than the Victorian novels, which is an amazing thing to say, right? Because we wouldn't expect that now, when we have so many rights, that we would not be able to put together a movie or a musical that gets that message across. But an example I'll give is from the musical Jane Eyre, which astonishingly is less feminist than the novel Jane Eyre. And the way in which it's less feminist has to do with the way a particular song, which is a good song, but the way that particular song works and is staged. And in this song, Jane is singing the words that in the novel she speaks from the roof of Thornfield Manor. In the novel, she says, it's her great sort of feminist speech that some people feel as though it's actually Charlotte Bronte's own words, where she says, men are ungenerous if you don't realize that women need as large a field of action as their brothers. And it's a piercing moment in the novel. And she speaks it alone, and she speaks it actually at Thornfield Manor from the roof. In the musical, it becomes a lecture that she's singing to her students at Lowood School. And so you might think at first, oh, wow, she's speaking out to the students. She's going to make a change. Yay, this is super feminist. But what actually happens is during that song, she starts to pack up her suitcase. And during the song, she closes her suitcase and she walks and strides across the stage. And she's singing about how she's going to go find a new job. And you know where she's going. It's to Thornfield Manor, where she is going to eventually find a husband. So it stops being, and the song is called Sweet Liberty. So the song stops being about liberty for all women and turns into liberty for just Jane. It's a very individual, personal journey. And her liberty is no longer liberty for all women, but liberty for herself to have a job and a husband. So
a great example.
that's an indictment.
It sounds like it.
Yeah. But it's fun to have that to say, isn't it? Right? It's fun to be able to say, oh, this modern musical, 2000, certainly as millennial as you can get, I guess you could say, is less feminist than the 1847 novel.
Yeah. Well, Danielle, maybe you can also answer the question about language. By the last question is how Shakespeare's language worked to improve students' socio-pragmatic competence as part of communicative purpose. But I think participants also asked, what about the probable level of difficulties when teaching Shakespeare or adapting Shakespeare or classic works to high school students as opposed to college level students?
Oh, absolutely, yes. And I'd be happy to answer that. And I just wanted to quickly thank I guess it's Pakari for that last question and for putting an insult into our chat thread, which was a delicious one. You can scroll back up and see. And I felt, I was just to say isn't there that subgenre of adaptation in which the fantasy is the fan who gets sucked into the world? There's like the Lost in Austin or the Austin Land mode where you can have that experience. And I totally agree, just as Professor Weltman has said for Victorian literature, often true with Shakespeare, that even though here we are as adaptation cheerleaders, the adaptations in some ways can often be more conservative or circumscribed. It's really hard, for instance, to find a film of Richard III that includes Queen Margaret, that forceful figure whose insult, thou elvish marked abortive root and hod, we started with, because she's such a powerful threat to Richard. And so usually the male director stars who want to play Richard, like Laurence Olivier or Kenneth Branagh, don't want to have that strong a rival to their screen presence. And so both Richard, Olivier and Branagh cut Margaret out entirely from their versions. But that also makes me think, when you think about the high school setting of teaching Shakespeare's language, it's a rich and wonderful place to teach. I taught high school literature for several years before I went to grad school, and that was in many ways my most meaningful and rewarding teaching. And it's a time when students are I think, relishing the possibilities of language and are often tremendously expressive in their own language. I mean, this is sort of trite to say, but I think we often see it on social media or in texting or on other informal platforms where students have a great sense of allusion and wordplay and reference. And so inviting students to do a kind of translation exercise where they take something that seems kind of obscure in Shakespeare and see how they might translate it into their own idiom can be a way of encouraging close reading and showing students' own linguistic competence. I had a group of students who were right about 18, 19. We were looking at another Renaissance text, which was a comedy by Thomas Middleton called A Chaste Maid in Cheapside, where a sort of social climbing family that's nouveau riche are trying to marry off their daughter advantageously. And the mother says to her daughter, in order to marry well, you need to take dancing lessons. And the line from Middleton is, you dance like a plumber's daughter. And the students who were translating that line, which in some ways doesn't need that much translation, translated it as, you dance like a white girl. And then we had this really interesting discussion in our class about what the different valences were of a racial designation and a gender designation versus a socioeconomic class designation, and how these different ideas function. I was thinking about Professor Weltman's conversation about the racialization of class and Robert Louis Stevenson as well. And then some of you know too, there was an explosion in high school Shakespeare adaptations, particularly in the 90s, that was spurred by high school 19th century British novel adaptations. So I think it was Amy Heckerling's film Clueless that brilliantly adapted Jane Austen's Emma to the world of Beverly Hills socialites that kind of created this subgenre. And then we got a version of Taming of the Shrew called 10 Things I Hate About You, and a version of Twelfth Night called She's the Man, and a version of Othello called O. And those are fascinating films to look at. They're often quite clever in their translation of Shakespearean dialogue and Shakespeare class structure to basically high school cafeteria social organizations, but I think are often, this goes back to Professor Weltman's point, slightly more conservative in their understanding of gender and sexuality than Shakespeare's plays afford. And so I love to explore with my students how they might think about what gender is being performed by Viola or Cesario, the sort of central love character in Twelfth Night, as opposed to what we learn about characters' bodies from the way that Amanda Bynes and Channing Tatum perform them in She's the Man, say, and ways in which we might see a slightly more essential or biologically fixed notion of gender in the Hollywood teen imagination than we could say on the Renaissance stage.
Right. There are questions about this is bringing cyber literature into cyber fan fiction. About the adaptation of the masterpiece works into several literatures, such as Harry Potter into cyber fan fiction, what framework to use in bridging the different media. So probably it's, yeah, it can also apply to Shakespeare's plays, so Victorian fiction, and also about different contexts, bringing, because of different culture. Professor Paul Quelser mentioned about your students use combining in English and Farsi language, probably something like that. Maybe you could both talk more about that.
Well, although the class that I teach, the one that I gave the course flyer for at the beginning of the PowerPoint, and this talk title include new media. I have to admit that I didn't really talk about new media. And this question allows me to bring that in. And I have to confess that most of the time when I might show one little web series example, but most of the time I leave the new media aspects of the class up to the students to bring in their class presentations. And they do. So Harry Potter fan fiction is a great example because a lot of Harry Potter fan fiction allows the students to talk about Harry Potter as a kind of adaptation of Oliver Twist. So they start off with, when we read Oliver Twist, one of the things we talk about is how Oliver's mother kisses him right before she dies, and is that a kind of a protective talisman? Because why else does he never actually ever get into any terrible trouble, even though he doesn't ever develop a Cockney accent, even though he's lived with and lived in a workhouse to the age of 9 and then lives in a den of thieves. So how is there a kind of almost a sort of Harry Potter magical quality about that? So students bring it in. Students talk about fan fiction and they bring in the web series and other new media themselves. So I leave it to them because they're the expert.
I love your notion, Professor Weltman, of seeing Harry Potter itself as a kind of Dickensian post-Victorian fan fiction. And that seems like one possible answer for Shakespeare as well, that Shakespeare was writing adaptations, but in some ways fan fiction of Christopher Marlowe and earlier writers, and even his own fan fiction, or at least his fans seem to have demanded, say, more Falstaff from the Henry plays, and so he would write Falstaff in Love and Merry Wives of Windsor, or Henry IV Part 2, which is just more Falstaff, and then there would be sort of standalone Falstaff works that would be written in the 18th century, 19th century as well. And a lot of, I think a lot of the Harry Potter, at least the slash fiction, is also imagining different erotic possibilities than are contained within the sort of conventional or mainstream young adult publishing modes, and that's fascinating to talk about too. But I think there are really interesting theoretical models for thinking about new media, and I am not the person who's developed them. But if you looked at Catherine Rowe's work on Second Life spaces and Shakespeare, or Elizabeth Tavara's work on Twitter sphere and Shakespeare and social media. There's been a lot of great work, even just you search digital Shakespeare. that's been a hugely exciting area of exploration. And I think I try to follow Professor Weltman's idea of letting my students lead me into it.
Okay, probably last question is 11 p.m. already here, Central Time. Somebody asked about using the adaptation for children literature. I happened to just read your article, Daniel, about Charles Lamb's and Mary Lamb's Tales of Shakespeare. So presenting Shakespeare for children. So maybe, well, if you have any suggestion or recommendation of the adaptation of Shakespeare or Victorian fictions for children literature?
It's such an interesting topic, and it's really one of the 19th century's great contributions to Shakespeare studies, is imagining the childhood of both the childhood of Shakespeare's characters and Shakespeare for children. And sometimes this is a type of adaptation that gets criticized today because it would involve what we might think of as a sort of benign censorship. So our term Bowdlerization, to sort of expurgate the naughty adult bits from a work, comes from the Bowdler brother and sister team that, I think they're brother and sister team, that published a family Shakespeare edition in the early 19th century. And this gets back to Professor Weltman's point about adaptation fueling canonization. The Bowdlers thought that Shakespeare was too good to have bad stuff in them, so they had to take the bad parts out of Shakespeare to show how good he actually was. And the Lambs, Charles and Mary Lamb, also had a very fraught life and fraught relationship, but wrote children's versions, which were actually the other way that I was introduced to Shakespeare. My grandma, having failed to get me to Much Ado About Nothing, bought me Lamb's Tales of Shakespeare. And I, as an 8-year-old, confused them as Shakespeare's Tales of Lamb, which prompted lots of jokes about merchant of venison and other meats from my relatives. But it's another great place to think about gender and genre, how the Lambs present these problematic endings of plays like Measure for Measure, say, or Taming of the Shrew, and what sort of conventions are included, and also how they relate these different media, how they turn dramatic speech into narrative prose. And I've argued that some of the literary techniques of representing interior psychology in the 19th century novel that, say, Jane Austen uses are analogous to, or maybe even derived from, the way that the Lambs turn, say, Shakespearean soliloquy into what we might call free and direct discourse, or a way of filtering a character's thought and idiom into a third-person narrative style. So those children's versions are fascinating to see. And then the other thing that you can look at in the 19th century is writers like Mary Cowden Clarke and Anna Jameson, who wrote fan fiction, prequels to Shakespeare's plays. There's a collection called The Girlhood of Shakespeare's Heroines that imagines what Ophelia was like weaving flowers as a child. And the best one, of course, is the Lady Macbeth prequel, because in Mary Cowden Clarke's imagination, Lady Macbeth spends a lot of time killing insects and torturing small animals until she finally meets a thane who's worthy of her political ambitions. But we can think of our interest, say, today in the kind of backstories of superheroes. You want to see The Dark Knight or the origin story of the Joker in a particularly gendered form, with this 19th century interest in what the life of Shakespeare's characters, and particularly heroines, would be as children, imagining a readership of young women who would want to see themselves reflected in these stories.
Thank you.
Well, there are many adaptations of children's literature, Victorian children's literature. Of course, and what's interesting about that is not only are there adaptations of Alice in Wonderland that we're maybe familiar with because Disney did them, or Peter Pan because it became, of course, there have been so many different adaptations of Peter Pan, from, some focusing on Peter, some focusing on Wendy, some focusing on Captain Hook. But what interests me about all of these adaptations is that they were first adapted by the Victorians for the Victorian stage, often as Victorian pantomimes. So it's really fun to go back to, if like me, you're interested in the genealogy of adaptation, to see how the earliest adaptations to pantomime stage or melodrama stage often become the kernel of what we now see in our more contemporary adaptations. So that you know, I commented earlier that many contemporary musicals first go to movies to help them condense enormous plots. If it worked well in a movie, maybe it would also work well on stage. What's interesting about that is those movies were actually themselves adapted from the earliest stage adaptations, as we saw with Jekyll and Hyde and the influence of Mansfield's, of Sullivan's vehicle that he wrote for Mansfield. But this is true for the earliest adaptations of the children's classics that we're familiar with from the Victorians as well. And so, in other words, if they seem, if Victorian, oh, here's another aspect to this. If Victorian novels seem particularly adaptable to performed media like plays and movies and TV shows, in part it's because Victorian novels were so influenced by the Victorian stage, and they were themselves already. First of all, they all knew that anything that they wrote as a novel would immediately be adapted to the stage. They often had in mind what it would look like when it was adapted to the stage. Dickens worked with some of the playwrights in order to try to control it. There was no copyright protecting him or any Victorian novelist, no copyright protected their work from being, pirated for the stage. But sometimes they would work with playwrights in order to in a friendly way, help control what ended up on stage. So if the novels are written with the stage in mind, how much sense it makes that they are then adapted to the stage and then remade as silent films and remade as talkies all the way up until now. Etta,
No, I just want to, some of the participants have not read Shakespeare plays. So somebody asks, what is the first Shakespeare plays that she needs to read? What's your suggestion?
Ooh, that's so tantalizing. I'm wary of sending you down the path of much ado frustration that I experienced myself. I mean, I would start with performance. I would start with seeing something that you love, and maybe it depends on what your particular taste might be. I think that Kenneth Branagh and Emma Thompson Much Ado holds up pretty well, and it's quite wonderful. But if your taste is more toward dark politics, then the Ian McKellen Richard III is totally delicious and fabulous also. And my heart is with A Midsummer Night's Dream, because that's where I met the love of my life. And I do tell my students they're not obliged to marry somebody they meet in my Shakespeare class, but extra credit if it happens down the line. Can you unmute yourself, Etta?
I'm sorry. Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Daniel Pollack-Pelsner, Dr. Sharon Wellman, for this enriching and guiding session, and also thank the participants for the questions. I'm sorry if there are still questions that we haven't managed to discuss. Maybe you can send the committee emails, and then committee, I will send it to Dr. Pollack-Pelsner and Dr. Wellman to answer. And yeah, Dr. Daniel Pollack-Pelsner and Dr. Sean Wellman have kindly agreed to share the slides. So if you need the slides, you can contact the committee and they will share the slides for you. Okay, thank you. It's been a pleasure to be moderator here, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Etta. Thank you, Sharon, and thank you all. It's a pleasure to get to see you and to learn from you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And
Okay. What a great presentation. Thank you, Dr. Sharon Wellman and Dr. Daniel Pollack-Pelsner. And thank you Bu Eta for moderating this webinar. And then the next session is the closing speech delivered by the Secretary of English Department, Faculty of Humanities, Diponegoro University, Mita Chandria SS MA. Mita, please.
Right, thank you, Elsa. Thank you very much, Dr. Sharon Waldman, and thank you very much, Dr. Daniel Pollack-Klausner, for the very insightful, inspiring, and enriching presentation and discussion. It's interesting to know how Victorian novels can be adapted to various forms. And it's also very interesting to know how Shakespeare language can be used to insult. It's attractive to make it more easier. We want to share our deep gratitude to both of you, and very sorry from Pak Agus because he cannot close the seminar. I also want to thank Bu Eta for becoming an excellent moderator. Thank you so much. And of course, for all the participants without whom this webinar would not be an excellent webinar, and there will be no interesting, insightful discussion without your attendance. Thank you very much for all of you. And Ibu Sharon and also Pak Daniel, allow me to call you using Indonesian address. Ibu Sharon and Pak Daniel, we hope in the future we can have another webinar with you. Interesting discussion and presentation about English literature. Thank you so much for Bu Sharon and Pak Daniel, for Bu Eta, and for all the presenters. Now I return to Elsa. Elsa?
Okay, thank you, Bumita. The next session is photo session. The participants, please turn on your video so we can take the pictures.
Yes.
Are we still taking picture, Elsa?
Okay, it's done. Okay, thank you for attending the international webinar series, Interpreting English Literature Now. Nice to see you all, and we'll see again in the next webinar. Good afternoon.
Good evening from here. Good night. Bye.
Good evening.
Bye.
Goodbye. Good night.
Bye, Ta.
Good night.
Goodbye. It's lovely to get to see you all.
Good night. Goodbye. See you.
Thank you.
Poeta, Mr. Daniel, and Mr. Bob.
Iki sing tak apa
Thank you, Daniel and Sharon. It was great. Thank you. I'm so happy.
Thank you, Pak Daniel. Thank you, Ibu Sharon, and thank you, Bu Eta.
Oh, my pleasure.
To be honest, I'm very much interested with the insult kit. I actually laugh a lot here, like, ooh.
Yeah,
wonderful.
it's that interesting.
And
Right, yay.
also, I learned from the British word, very droll, very funny. That's right? Professor Daniel, that's correct, right? Droll means funny, right?
I love it. Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you.
There was a
Professor Sharon
glory
and
in all
Professor
that.
Daniel, very insightful. Thank you.
Yes, very
Thank you so much
inspiring
for all
and
your work to
enriching.
arrange this.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. I'm leaving now, yeah.
Good evening, everyone. Good night.
Good night, Professor Sharon, Professor Daniel, Ibu Eta. Good night.
Night, bye.
Good
Thank you.
night.
Night, Edna. It's at night, is that right?
Yeah, it's 11 p.m. here, Central Time, and in Oregon it's 9, I think.
9?
Yeah. Yeah.
Oregon at 9.
Abi, please.
Daniel, are the kids already in bed?
Oh, from your mouth to somebody's ears. They've been, my children are 8 and 11, and they've been rehearsing their own performance of Frozen 2 in the room next door, using our puppy as Sven the reindeer. And I've just been relieved that they haven't burst in yet to get a captive audience for the show. But and they will be amazed too. They said, "You're talking about Shakespeare. Nobody's going to want to listen to this." So I am so delighted that you've proved them wrong.
Yeah, they don't like Shakespeare, so probably they need their grandmother to introduce them to Shakespeare.
You're right. You're absolutely right. I love that suggestion, Ed.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, bye all. Thank you, Professor Daniel and Professor Sharon. Bye-bye.
Bye, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Eta. Thank you, Mita. Thank you all.
Thank you, Ibu. Thank you, Bundina.
Yeah, so we have 200 class. That's good. That's actually
I'm glad
great.
that everybody turned their video on at the end for the photo, because it was a treat to get to see such a wonderful assembly of people here.
It really was. I agree.
If you want to have the pictures, I can ask the committee and I will send them.
I would love to see the picture. I would love it.
Right. Okay. So the 200 something. It's great success. Thank you very much for both of you. I was a bit nervous, but yeah.
You did a wonderful job, and I hope you feel a great sense
Yeah,
of
it's
accomplishment
wonderful.
having arranged this this very significant and expansive event.
Yes.
Thank you. Yeah. And my colleagues have been great in also helping me with things that I cannot do. Since I'm here, they're there.
How did it come about? How did you think to do this? I mean, you know, how did it begin?
So basically, because every year we have inviting professors from from abroad, but because of the pandemic, then we cannot do that. So, but we cannot invite professors to come to Semarang to Bangunlah University. But on the other hand, it's also a great opportunity, because then we can just invite anybody from every corner of the world.
Yes.
So, yeah. But for the topics, so basically it's English literature related to teaching, related to students. But you helped me finding the topic actually, Sharon. Thank you. And yeah, with Shakespeare's, it's just perfect. I told you that in our curriculum, we have Renaissance drama, Victorian fiction, Victorian prose, and Elizabethan? No, romantic poetry. So those are 3 courses that we have in our curriculum, right, Bumita?
Yes, Beta. We have it in our curriculum.
Uh-huh. So, yeah, so the core of English literature.
Oh, Pak Daniel, by the way, I asked my students concerning English literature. I asked them, why are you taking English as your major? And the answer is quite various. And one answer is very much interesting for me. Well, it's because my passion is in English literature. What about, but did you think, or do you think, because before you are making that decision, do you think as well about your future career? And he replied, his reply is very much interesting for me. He's saying something like this: well, my passion has nothing to do with my future career.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, I was like shocked, like surprised. Huh? So what should I say? Like, so why should you take English literature? Because it's my passion. Because I want to study about literature, English literature. While my career, what I want to do with my life after college, it's something else. Because he actually wants to raise, he wants to be a businessman, and he wants to raise farm, how to say it with that, like he wants to have a business on farming, like keeping pets, chicken, something like that. So it's completely different from his passion. And actually all of them are open-minded, and also their parents as well. To my surprise, their parents are also very supportive. Their parents are encouraging them to go to English department or English literature. There's no problem with it. So yeah, so
great to
Sharon and
hear.
Daniel, it turned out to be that young people nowadays in Indonesia is, like probably having a different perspective concerning what their major in universities.
I'm so glad, Bhumita, that you reported back on that conversation, because you told us that you were going to have it with your students. That's wonderful. And it makes me think that a very common mode for Shakespeare and his contemporaries to write in is the pastoral mode, in which people are nostalgic for the life of farming or the life of sheep herding. And much of As You Like It, Shakespeare's play, is about people from the court who leave to go to the forest and learn what it's like to raise sheep. So I think your student who's interested in farming will be very well prepared after having studied Shakespeare at university for a life of agriculture afterward.
Right, yes. Right.
So it makes me curious whether both of you just chose literature from the very beginning, or you just, well, just like me, I didn't really want to be in the English literature.
Honest expression.
Yeah.
I have to admit that it was literature from the beginning. And in fact, when I went to grad school, I didn't know what I wanted to concentrate in within within literature in general. I didn't know that I was going to be a Victorianist, but I just kept taking classes in Victorian literature because I kept enjoying those classes so much. So I think Daniel's going to have to talk for a moment because I need to drink.
No, I know that mode, Sharon, and I had a similar experience. So in graduate school, I read a Dickens novel. I was assigned to read Our Mutual Friend, his last novel, for my entering exams, and I was totally smitten by it. I actually read it on my honeymoon. And it was the exact opposite guide to what one should do in a happy marriage, but a wonderful introduction to the complexities of Victorian literature. And I thought, how come nobody told me these works were so stylistically interesting and socially engaged? But I'd always kind of wanted to be a Shakespearean, and I had a sense that being a Shakespearean was what one ought to be if you love theater and you love literary history. And I was a little bit torn, and then I learned, and Sharon knows this, that the Victorians were as obsessed with Shakespeare as I was, and I could simply displace my own passion onto the Victorians. And so I focused in graduate school on how Victorian novelists adapted Shakespeare and got to kind of do both. And then I teach at a small school in Portland, Oregon, where I grew up, near where my parents are, that where you don't have to really focus on one particular thing because we don't have graduate students. And so I felt fortunate to be able to still do some teaching a class now on secret lives in Victorian literature, and teaching my Shakespeare and performance classes.
Oh, yeah, that's interesting. So we still have my ex-student here, Gabrielle. she's one of, I think, very passionate in literature. She always did excellent in every assignments that I gave.
Good morning, Miss Mita.
Hey, good morning.
So,
Yeah, I
so tell me, did you want to be in English
yeah,
literature?
morning, Miss Meta. Yeah.
Gabby? Yeah, did you really want to study English literature? Oh.
Oh, well, yes, to be honest, yes, very much. I just love to read the Victorian era novels ever since I was in high school, ever since I was first exposed to it. But, well, in contrary to the students that Ma'am Mita has told with the conference here, unfortunately, my parents are not quite supporting me for that. Yeah, but for now, I am actually teaching at the theater major, which is a bit of a challenge since I don't have much theater experience. Hence my question before then. Yeah.
Yeah, so we have different kinds of students with different background. With parents do not agree, they study English literature. With parents who wonder why you're not happy. Well, that's me. Yeah, but it's interesting. Bumita is thinking about pursuing. Well, Bumita is in linguistic. Her field is linguistic, but she's very interested in novels.
Right.
Yeah. Maybe you can ask Dr. Waldman or Dr. Paul Pelstar how to, I don't know, to have a topic for.
But Poeta, to be honest, because my background was not English literature, I don't have that kind of, what do you call it? I don't have that kind of confidence to study English literature because I'm kind of afraid that I don't have the context. I don't have any knowledge concerning the context. So I would prefer reading Indonesian novels rather than English novels. Well, probably it's too naive a thought, but what I have in mind right now is that, well, to some extent, I probably will be able to understand Indonesian novels a lot better than English novels. Because, yeah, as I told you previously, I don't have any knowledge about English literature. I'm afraid I will be, like trapped and lost somewhere because I don't have the cultural context. When I was a student, I remember that I told my teacher at the time, Bu Ratna at the time actually, when I was about to report about, when I had finished reading Wuthering Heights, and then the lecturer asked me to report about it. She asked me to comment on it. My comment was that it's strange. It's a very bad novel. And she was like surprised. How on earth you can say that? Then I started to explain everything. And then she said, well, it's because you don't have the background. You don't know the context. Then she started to explain everything to me. Since then I realized I had to be very careful when reading novels or any literature, any literary work. I needed to be very, very careful. So I'm not master in English novels, unfortunately, but I'm trying to study Indonesian novels from linguistic perspective, which is quite complicated for me, but I'm still trying to learn.
Yeah.
Hi. Hi, little girl. Very cute.
Yeah.
My father, Brian.
Hi.
To tell me that it's bedtime.
Yes.
It's your bedtime. It's past your bedtime. I'm sorry. So your dad needs to go with you?
I'm afraid I need to sign off, but Bhumita, I'm glad to hear about your wonderful interests, and I would encourage you and happy to stay in touch. And Gabby, good to get to meet you and appreciate your work. And Bueta, thank you so much for hosting us so generously and involving everybody in the discussion. And Sharon, it is always such a treat to learn from you and get to be in dialogue with you. I hope we'll get to do it again soon.
Likewise, Daniel. It's absolutely always a treat. And yes, let's do it again soon.
Okay. Take care. Excuse me for saying good night at this point. But
Good
I wish
night.
Thank
all
you,
the best.
Daniel. Thank you, Pak. Good night.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. I should probably also head out and at least get another glass of water.
Right, you do that. Thank you, Sharon.
Thank
Ibu
you.
Sharon.
It was,
Have a good night, Ibu.
Yeah, thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you very much. Good night.
Good night.
Have a good night, Ibu. Thank you, Bu Eta. It's time for you to sleep as well.
Thank you, Gabby.
Thank you, Bu Eta.
Thank you,
Yeah,
Gabby. Thank you,
Yeah,
Bu
thank you,
Retno. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Bu Eta. Thank you, Bu Eta.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye. Take
So
care.
nice to see you. It's nice
We are
to see you
hoping
again.
to see
Yeah,
you
thank
soon,
you.
Bu Eta,
Goodbye.
in person. We are hoping to see you soon, in person.
Soon, hopefully.
Okay. Yes. Thank
Okay.
you.
Bye.
Bye. Take care.
Take care.